This is a video on track and track making. This is my layout, Baseford North. The track we can see here has been made up from C&L individual components. The points and turnouts are all made to a gauge of 31.5mm. This gives a much tighter crossing on the frog. This was all made from a template design, which was designed to fit inside this room. The beauty of template is that it will allow you and not allow you to do things that won't work, but it also adds a typical prototypical flow to the track work. As you can see, these particular turnouts are laid with wooden sleepers. And if we follow the layout round, we come to another set of turnouts. This is the entrance to the storage yard. These turnouts, again, designed in template to fit the location. And these are laid with plastic sleepers. We've had some experience of gauge narrowing occasionally with plastic sleepers, so it'll be interesting to see how these two compare. As we move on into the storage yard, as this is off-scene, the turnouts don't have to be so prototypical. So there's some turnouts laid on copper-clad sleepers. They're obviously cheaper and they're a lot quicker to knock up. And also you can configure them obviously design them to go in any particular location. So as we move through, we can see we've gone to a three-way turnout here, which gives an extra bit of length to the three roads, incorporating all the turnouts close together, or tandem turnout. In the storage yard, I've used pico points for speed of laying. Obviously pico points are laid to a fixed geometry, so the angles are all fixed. That's fine, and it works perfectly happily here. You can see I'm in the process of laying it out, and it's all designed to fit in with that geometry. So we get a nice straight run and no kinks or sudden changes of direction, which is the last thing you need. All this is wired for DCC, so one of the things you need to do with a pico point is to separate the switch rails from the frog. They need to be the same polarity as the stock rails, and then that will work perfectly fine. They're all controlled by tortoise motors, and I use the switch on the tortoise motor like a micro switch inside it. One is used to switch the polarity of the frog, and the other one has a feed back to the control panel for LED lights on the panel to show what position the point is in. As we just move on a little bit further down, you can see I'm just still laying out this out, and I've printed out templates so that I can work out how to fit these curved points into this section here to get the curve around into the storage yard. So we're just going to talk a little bit about point construction. This is a point that I'm making up for my storage yard. It's off-scene. I've designed the point on template with a 6-foot minimum radius curve on the inside. So I've printed it out. The template will allow you to print each point out individually on an A4 printer, so I've had to stick them together. I've laid double-sided sellotape along the point, and so I've been cutting copper-clad sleepers from strip along here to make this up. It's very quick and easy. Once they're laid and the rails are down, then we'll get a disc cutter and just cut the insulation gaps in. And then once these are laid out, we can then start thinking about attaching the rail. When it comes off the template, we can just pull the double-sided sellotape off the back, and we can lay the point raw onto the layout. So we'll continue with the rail in a moment. We can now think about fitting the rails. So this is the stock rail. It comes in 1/2 metre lengths. This is from C&L. This rail will be, we always have a datum, so this rail will be the datum rail. So everything else measures from this rail. We start with this rail and everything follows through from it. And it will be soldered onto the sleepers. I'll do that in a minute. But what I've done with this rail, what I do with my rails is my stock rails, I file a part for a recess for the point blade to go into. Find the right side of it. So the point blade will just slip into there. It's not very prototypical, but I prefer it. I think it gives better running, more reliable running. so the point blade will fit just nicely into there. I buy machined point blades. It's a lot less work and a lot less filing. The time takes a lot of time, and I find it easy just to buy them. But I'll file up the crossing V shortly. So what I've done with this, I've marked the stock rail where I want that to start, just at the beginning there, and I've taken the file to it. And it's only a shallow cut because the point blades are quite fine. I think we're pretty well as far as I want it. I'll just draw a file out to tidy it up. It's easier to do with this with the rail in the flat before you actually curve it. But I think that's going to fit all right in there. This is an off-scene point, obviously, so it's not too critical on the appearance, although we like to do a tidy job, of course. But that should work just fine. So what I'll do then is I'll curve this. It's slightly longer than I would normally need because I'm going to add more sleepers. It's got to join up with two existing pieces of track, so I'll do that in situ. And now this is ready, we can just gently curve that round. It doesn't take too much effort. You have to watch you don't get sudden kinks in it, that's the only thing. And when that's ready, we can fire up the soldering iron in a minute and get cracking with that. So we're now ready to we're just ready to solder this rail in. I've already just tacked it in several places, just so we get the curve right on here. So I'll just tack it along here. And I'm using 60/40 solder. Everything's new and nice and clean, so it solders fine. No need to use flux because it makes a horrible mess and takes ages to clean up. So once we've got our tacks in place, we can rather untidily solder these in. Get enough heat into there. It's not going to be the prettiest of jobs, but it's off scene, so it'll do. So rather you watch me so badly solder all those in, the next stage is to prepare the crossing V. So this one's a 1 in 7, and I've got a 1 in 7 template. I've already prepared one rail, which will go in there like that. One rail will go ahead slightly, and it'll be this one. So one will actually form the actual point of the V. And to create this, what I normally do is I leave a foot on one side, the actual foot of the ball head rail I leave, and I just file the head off. And that's the other thing with this, just make sure we get it the right way up. And then once that I've got an angle filed on there, we can just straighten that end. So, and looking down it to make sure it's straight, so then we've got a nice straight edge which will go in there. And then once that's done, we can then file the join to join up with the other rail. It takes a bit of trial and error. Once you've done about 20, you get your eye in. And when they're in, we can make sure they line up with my ruler gun. We can make sure they line up, and we'll get a nice point on there. The rail really, strictly speaking, should be inclined at 1 in 20. As it sits in chairs, it normally has it has an incline on it. Obviously, it's vertical here, so it's not quite prototypical again, but it will do for our storage yard. And I'll just tidy up this V, and then we'll carry on with the next section. I'm just preparing this crossing V now. It takes a little bit of filing just to get this planed off just right, and we can just tidy this up so it looks a little bit neater. Get that in the jig, and then we can put a ruler on just to make sure we're in the right position there. We can be ready to solder that up. okay like that. I've got these in various sizes, all the jigs that we need for setting the different crossing angles. A whole set of these just saves a lot of work and makes it just a little bit easier. So again, I'm just going to solder this using 60/40. This is where your asbestos fingers come in handy. But again, this new rail, it's all nice and clean, so it just solders up perfectly. Don't need any flux. And we can just clear off that excess solder once we're done. It's cooled down a bit. So this is the crossing V. I made a right botch job of it, so I had to redo it. It's always the same when you're showing somebody. So I've cleaned that up now. It's just in there, tied up the top. I'm using these track gauges. These are 31.5mm track gauge. The 32mm gauge that's the Guild standard, or the O gauge standard, is quite generous, and it's a little bit sloppy. If you get a four-wheel wagon and put it on a piece of plain track, you can see there's quite a lot of sideways movement. But the advantage of using 31.5mm on a turnout is that it closes up this gap here between the nose of the crossing and the wing rails. When that gap is larger, with just a standard 32mm gauge, it's very easy for wheels to drop into that and they clunk across the crossing. So by tightening this up, it looks better and it runs better. So these gauges will just fit nicely there, and then now they're in place, I can go around with the soldering iron and just get those in nicely. They are available commercially, 31.5, but we had them just made at a local engineering works. It was relatively inexpensive. So right, we'll solder that crossing V in next. We can see here, I've now progressed a little further. I've now put the other stock rail in, and again still working outwards from the datum, and I've got 3 of these gauges, and obviously set the gauge here and then just follow the line round and set the gauge at the other end. And what I normally do on some of these, just put a little kink in one side, just the very slightest of bends, just to bring that away from the blade as it curves away. I've also prepared the point blade, which is here. That will drop into there, and it's best to curve the rails rather than solder them in under tension. So it's best to curve it so that it'll sit where it's supposed to go. And with this, you can see that the blade is not hard up against the stock rail. That's so there's no pressure either way, so when I'm using tortoise point motors, it can move that blade backwards and forwards with a minimum amount of pressure. Obviously if the blade's sprung hard over, the point motor has to work against that pressure to bring it over. So it just works a little bit more reliably and easier for the point motor. And I'm now just preparing the wing rail. There's plenty of offcuts of rail from this, so the wing rail is here, so we can just make a start on that. And when you make the bend in the rail, it's never as far as you think it's going to be. So yeah, I've overdone that a little bit. I'll bring that back. Now the secret with these is, even though you're using gauges, is to look along the rail to make sure it all lines up nice. I had to have several goes at getting this knuckle right. I hadn't got the bend in quite the right place, and that's what I found by looking along the rail to make sure it all lined up okay. And you have to make sure that obviously the wing rail here is parallel with the V here. So I had about 4 or 5 goes to get that right, to get that bend just in the right place. And again, this rail is bent so it just drops into place. There's no tension, you don't have to push it in any direction to make it fit. It should just sit there. And if it's wrong and you can't get it right and it gets a mess, just chuck it away into your scrap bin and make a new piece. Same with the V. If you're making up the V and you cannot get the angle right, if it's going horribly wrong, it's no effort to just cut the end off and make another one. That's why you use your V rails coming in here as long as possible,
So if you make a mistake, you can cut it off. And where I've been cutting rails, I've been using my Zurons. Of course, it leaves a fairly untidy end, so you just tidy up the ends just to make it nice. And if it's connecting to another piece of track and you need fish plates, just handy just to tidy up the web, and just the top and the bottom. So if you're using slide-on fish plates, they'll slide on more easily, and that will go in there. So now this wing rail's in place, I can then make up the other one, and I'll put in this point blade. Again, just using the gauges to work down. And I'll leave about 8 or 9 free sleepers up this end for the blade to move. Obviously there's a gap here because the frog is all one polarity, it switches polarity for this section, so there needs to be a break between the stock rail, so that takes place just here, and then we'll cut the insulation gaps in the sleepers a bit later. So we're nearly there. I've made up the check rails, just from, you get plenty of offcuts, so these are easy to make up, put in. Just tidied up the ends, they can go on, and then we can just use our gauge to put these in place. I've already bent a curve, because it's a curved section of line, so I've just bent a curve into it, so I'm not putting any force on it. That's in place there, so we can just solder that in. I'm short of point blades, so I've only got one point blade on this this turnout. A friend of mine is very kindly actually machining them up for me by planing them on a miller. So I'm waiting for the next delivery. So I've only got one point blade on this particular point at the moment, but just a couple of other little things we'll do before we finish. I did make a little bit of a botch job on the crossing nose. I think the crossing nose is slightly too far that way, so I've had to just grind a little bit off the rail to get it to fit. But there's quite a short distance here between the nose and the actual point of where the wing rails close. So if we get a wagon, we can just put this across just to check that this runs okay, because there's bits of solder on the rail, but we can just, it's going to go across there fine, no problems. And you can see, you probably can't quite see from that angle, but the wheel doesn't drop into that gap, so that's good. So now I can just carry on and put the other check blade on, and we're sort of on the home straight. So I'm just cutting the insulation gaps in the copper sleepers. Makes a fairly unpleasant dust, so try not to breathe that in. Once you've cut them all, it's probably just advisable to get an electrical test, short circuit tester, to make sure they sometimes get whiskers of copper bridge the gap, so just need to make sure that the sides are electrically insulated. For the tie bar, I use, just like the real thing, brass ones. They go either side of a piece of double-sided PCB. They're nice and discreet, and prototypically I think they look quite good. They have a little tab on the bar that just fits nicely into the web of the rail. Obviously I can't fit this one because I've only got one point blade, but that will go there, and I use them on the non-scenic section as well. You can use bits of PCB. I prefer to use these. I think they're just a little bit neater. And we're pretty well there, really. Just need to clean up the tops of the rails. Once that's done and we've got the other point blade in, we can then take the backing off. That'll just strip off then, and we can lay the point down. So we'll just go and have a a test fit on the actual layout in a moment, just to give you some context of where this is going. So this is where the point is going to go on the layout. I've left these rails extended so that I can align it to the next two turnouts, so that'll fit in. I should probably do a little bit playing around with the sleepers here so these can interlace. You can see there's another one beyond there. These are also both custom made to fit into this particular location, because you can get a pico curved point, but the curved point has the radius is tighter than 6 foot, so this is based on a 6 foot radius curve here. So we're pretty well ready to install it. Once I get the other point blade, I can put the stretcher in, drill the hole for the tortoise point motor. The arm will come up through that 10mm hole, and we're ready to carry on progressing the track around the layout. These are fairly quick to knock up, as I said in the previous video. They take about a third of the time of a normal C&L point, where you use individual components to make them up. But these obviously are just a ticket for using in the storage yard, where they don't have to look too prototypical. So there we are.